I'm so glad to see you all here, and I'm so happy to be here. I wanted to start by thanking the Meter Center and especially Corrine for the invitation to talk, and a big thanks to Sam for helping me get set up and making sure I had the correct version of my notes printed out. That took a couple tries, but he was very patient. I'm excited to share a little bit about my research. I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to talk about other parts of my research, whatever you might have questions about. So I want to start by saying that this great exhibit in the Meter Center, where you have the posters here, is a nice complement to what I'm going to be talking about. Some of the descriptions talk about the sort of extraordinary women of the Reformation, like Idelette de Boer, and Jeanne de Jussy, the nun who wrote about the closing of the convent in Geneva. Those are not the women that I'm going to be talking about, who show up in the consistory records. So I think it is really important as we continue learning about the Reformation to highlight the women who participated in leading and writing as part of the Reformation. And then it is also important to try to find the traces of the rest of the women who were part of Reformation life. And one way that we can do that is by looking into the consistory records. So I want to start, I always like to start with a map, just to remind us all where we are. I imagine that a good number of people in this room have been to Geneva. But just as a quick reminder that the Geneva that I'm going to be talking about in the 1550s and 1560s, when John Calvin was there leading the Reformation, is still in the same location, but what is east of it it was a different Europe, right? It was in a Europe where religion was still very much in the midst of transformation and challenges and confrontation and conflict, where you not have a united Germany or a united Italy. Life was different in many ways, and one of the things that sometimes does not always come across in all of the studies that focus on the ideas of John Calvin and theological debates. We do not always see in those the daily lives of people in the mid-1500s, which were also different than our daily lives in some pretty significant ways. So I'm going to tell you a few stories about some of the women that we can see in the consistory and talk a little bit about why it matters to try to unearth them out of the consistory records. So let me start really briefly with the one woman who is maybe the best known, not as well known as the women in the exhibit upstairs, but for people who work on the Genevan consistory records, one woman whose name is probably best known, just start with her for 1 minute, is a woman named Pernette Grant. Pernette Grant appeared before the Genevan consistory, so this is the morals court, that is the disciplinary body of the Reformed Church that was established by agreement between John Calvin and the city government, when the city government, newly independent, trying to make sure that it didn't succumb to the King of France or the Duke of Savoy, who really were still hoping to take Geneva back over. The city council agreed, as part of persuading John Calvin to come back to Geneva, to create the consistory, to create this disciplinary body. And in December of 1545, Pernette Grant, who was a well-known woman in the city. Her son was a member of the city government. He ended up being one of the main political opponents of John Calvin. Pernette Grant appears before the Genevan consistory. It matters that it's in December because the consistory was often busy in December, questioning people to make sure that they were prepared to take communion, that they were reconciled with the community. And when Pernette Grant, this is the actual page from the consistory records, when she appeared before the consistory, she had been sent there by the city council accused of creating scandal in the city by insulting John Calvin, the leader of the church. And even though John Calvin had tried to speak to her directly, he had talked to her many times, she had not changed her behavior. And so she ended up before the consistory. And one of the things that I love about this entry is the description that the secretary, as he is taking the notes, he describes Pernette Grant as too talkative and obstinate. Not uncommon words in the consistory records to describe women. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So the too talkative, overly talkative, and obstinate Pernette Grant is accused of creating scandal, and she stands there and says to the consistory, which was made up of 12 male elders, 5 or 6 male ministers, and one of the syndics, one of the 4 leaders of the city government. She stands and says to them, Monsieur Calvin was the cause of the scandal and dissension, because if he hadn't come here, things would not have turned out like this. One of my favorite quotations from the consistory. This story is really well known, but it has been told almost only as part of the story of Calvin's political opponents. When Pernette Grant has appeared in scholarship, she has just been an example. She is the mother of Ami Perrin, and she's just one more example of these families who were causing so much trouble for John Calvin. And the story continues up until 1555. So I'm not here today to say that no one who has ever studied the history of Geneva and Calvin and the Reformation has ever noticed that women were part of that society. But I am here to say that maybe there is more that we could know about these women if we stop and ask some different questions. So yes, Pernette Grant is part of a family and even a social network who really challenged the power of the consistory and challenged the power of John Calvin. And yes, there is a political fight that happens. But also, Pernette Grant was a woman who stood up in front of an all-male court and was willing to say directly, not through a lawyer and not through a male representative, right? She was willing to say directly that she had a problem with the way that John Calvin was leading the Reformation. Just to be clear, she was not saying that she thought Geneva should go back to Catholicism. She was not saying she had a problem with the Reformation, but she was willing to articulate her own ideas and to confront Calvin and the consistory directly. And that is not the part of the story that usually gets told. And as I have been working through the consistory records, I've been working with them for a long time, ever since I started on baptism. One of the things that I started noticing more and more is how many traces of women's stories and women's lives we can find in these consistory records, and how often those have been overlooked because people who have been using the consistory records, including often me at the beginning, were really focused on figuring out, what did the consistory want? What was the consistory trying to do? Did it work? Did it not work? And what were the obstacles to the consistory achieving its goals? And with that set of questions, Pernette Grant is just an obstacle. But if we step back and ask some different questions, we start noticing some different details about what is going on with women in the consistory, and about what these consistory records, noting down, recording the sessions run by this male disciplinary body, recorded by a male secretary, recording the answers to questions asked by men, still what those records can tell us about women's voices and the ways that women were experiencing life during the Reformation in Geneva. So why, you might ask, this sounds sort of obvious. Why hasn't this been done before? Why does this need to be done? What is the big deal? I like to call this the Reformation wall effect. I'm going to guess that in this room there might be a lot of hands when I ask this question. How many of you have been to Geneva ever? Yes. And how many of you, when you went to Geneva, have stood and down up there? And how many of you have thought, like, wow, those are really, really tall reformers? They are, right? They are looming over Geneva. I think this is such a good visual representation of the way that Calvin in particular has loomed over the history of Reformation-era Geneva, right? That he was so important and such a strong leader and so prolific in his writing. You can spend a whole lifetime studying just Calvin's writing and still not be done. So it's understandable why he has overshadowed all of these other questions, but it means that people have been lost in the shadows. And I think there are ways that we can find those people. I'm focusing on women, but it is also true for Genevan men who were not theologians and who were not kind of part of the city government. So the Reformation wall effect, I think, has for a long time, until the 1970s and 80s, really limited or structured the way that historians tried to look at the Reformation in Geneva. Starting in the 1970s and 1980s, we had a number of scholars who started going back into the archives and looking at the consistory records. And that is when we started to get a more fleshed out understanding of what it looked like when the ideas of the reformers got put into practice. So again, I don't want to come in here and claim that like no one has ever done any of this before. There is great work by William Monter and Bill Kingdon and Bob Kingdon, my advisor, and more recently by Jeffrey Watt and William Nafee and Corinne Mogg and my own work that has been now for several decades digging into the consistory records. But again, I think that we often have still been limited by focusing on what the consistory was trying to achieve. And I think if we step back and ask some different questions, there's a lot more to learn about what is going on with women's lives. So instead of asking what were the consistory's goals and how did they want people in Geneva to be living, we can ask, what, if we look closely at the consistory records, what can we find out about what was possible in women's daily lives and how women interacted with each other and the people around them, not only with the consistory, and certainly not only with John Calvin. So the ways that I'm going to talk through this, I'm going to give you some examples of sort of three places that we can see through the consistory records women interacting with each other and with men and with the reformers in Geneva. One is an example of how that happens sometimes in church. Second is an example of women interacting with each other in their own home or in one of their homes. And then the third is an example of Genevan women visiting the public baths, which you might not even know existed because they don't get talked about very often. So I have a story, I want to tell you a story about each of those places to help us think about how understanding a little bit more about women's daily lives in Geneva during the Reformation can help us then go back and sort of rethink the whole process of implementing the ideas of reform. Okay, so my first story for you is a story of something that happened in church, in Saint-Pierre, the main church in Geneva. There's very little art from Geneva in the 1500s, so most of my pictures are from other places. But the reason I have this picture, this is probably the most famous picture of a reformed worship space in the 1500s. And I really want you to have, this is smaller than Saint-Pierre, but I want you to sort of have that image in your head as I'm telling you this story. So this story is about a woman named Françoise Bernard. And this, again, we're looking for these women inside of the consistory record. So this is the first page of the consistory records where Françoise appears. Françoise was the sister of one of the first Catholic priests who had converted to the Reformation in Geneva. So she's connected into the Reformation clergy. And in her, in the first entry, where she first comes to see the consistory, she was once again accused of causing a ruckus, causing scandal, and upsetting other women in Geneva. And her response was that she admitted that recently and often she does go to the sermon at Saint-Pierre with great tumult and insult, taking her seat with great scandal. Probably as an example of where the notary was paraphrasing what she said. I'm not sure that she would have admitted that directly, but the entry goes on. Not only does she come take her seat with great scandal, but she brings snacks with her. And then we have a list: pretzels, apples, pears, chestnuts, and walnuts to share with the people around her. But she denied ever drinking alcohol at church, which had been another one of the accusations against her. That was just the first entry. This entry did not solve the consistory's concerns whatsoever. And so, as they usually did, a week later they called a group of witnesses. And this group of witnesses was other women who usually sat around the same place as Françoise. One thing that is interesting about this group of women is that some of them were elite women from Geneva who were sitting with their servants in the same space. And one of them is a laundress who is also sitting in that same space. So we have women from across kind of socioeconomic and status groups all meeting together at church. The two most elite of these women were a woman named Jeanne Baudichon and a second woman named Pernette Maisonneuve. So they get interviewed first. The first one, Jeanne Baudichon, was the widow of a wealthy merchant who was a participant, who had been a member of the city government and had been a strong supporter of John Calvin. So she sort of checks all the boxes as the most respectable possible witness for the consistory. She reported that this whole issue actually started before, it wasn't just about church. So her first statement about Françoise was that one day when she had been returning from a visit to the public baths, we'll come back to that later, with Pernette Maisonneuve, who was the wife of a current syndic, the current head of the city government. They had been returning from their visit to the public baths, and down the other side of the street comes Françoise Bernard, and Françoise Bernard sort of yells at them across the street and calls out to Jeanne, "Hey girl, how you doing?" That's the best I could translate. This is not something that made Jeanne Baudichon happy. She reported this to the consistory as completely offensive, that this woman would have taken such liberties to greet her so casually in the street. The next witness, Pernette Maisonneuve, she agreed that this had happened and she had been there. She added that she often saw Françoise acting as if she was inebriated, even in church. And then she added more information. She said that one time when they were at Saint-Pierre for the sermon, Françoise came in and fell in the middle of all the women who were already seated, and that she had also seen Françoise eating at church, and that she created many scandals because she always walks past all the women instead of just sitting down. So one of the things I love about this story is the way the personalities come out, right? This is something that is happening in church at the sermon. And what is bothering these different women is the kind of thing that like bothers most people about their neighbors or their family members, right? The interrogation or the questioning of witnesses continued the next week. We had another woman who was a widow of Robert Estienne, who was a French printer who had come to Geneva. She said she never noticed any of these things. And she never had even seen Françoise get up from her seat, right? So from her point of view, Françoise was perfectly orderly and there was no problem at all. And then comes the laundress, whose name was also Jeanne. And the laundress said, I don't know if I've ever seen her drinking, but she definitely always pushes back past everyone to get to her seat, even if there's an easier way to get there. I wish I could go back and interview all of these women, right, and find out what else was going on here. The last woman who gets interviewed was François' own servant. And her own servant attempts to explain that none of this could have happened because Françoise had already eaten, so why would she bring snacks? And she hadn't drunk any alcohol. But then it turned out that the servant was making this up because she hadn't been at the sermon, because she actually had been sent by Françoise to a different service, to catechism. We'll get in a minute to why I think that that is important. At the end of all of this, the consistory is still very unhappy with Françoise. Her servant gets sent or gets excommunicated, gets prohibited from communion for lying, strangely for lying about having been at catechism, which is where they wanted her to be. And Françoise continues after this to be an annoyance to many of her neighbors. So this easily can be a story of the way that women often are described by the consistory in Reformation Geneva. That she was being disruptive, right? That she was distracting other people from the sermon. That she was, obviously that she was coming to church drunk, right? We could just write this off as a story of a problematic woman who is not following Reformed expectations. Or we could think about things that we learned from this entry. Number one thing I think we learn is that this woman that the consistory is so frustrated with, and who they want to hold up as a model of someone who is not living a reformed life, maintained her responsibility as the mistress of a servant of making sure her servant went to catechism. Life was complicated, right, in this period of time. So sometimes we can learn from reading these sources a little bit differently that women in Geneva had different ways of thinking about their religious responsibilities. It was not the same thing as wanting the city to be Catholic again. It was not the same thing as not wanting to live in Geneva. But they had their own ways of adapting Reformed expectations to their personal lives. We also learn from a case like this that what people eat for snacks. That sounds kind of silly, but I think that is also a really important part of trying to understand people's daily lives in Geneva, right? That we don't get out of theological writings. So when we look closely at the consistory records, we learn something about daily lives in terms of material, right? What they're eating, how they are sitting, and how they are filling up space together, and how they are bumping into each other. And maybe most interestingly, there is no witness in this case who is a minister. This is exactly the kind of case that was very common for ministers to come and complain to the consistory, that people were being too loud during sermons or causing problems. That sort of standard understanding that Calvin and the other ministers were really frustrated that people were not attentive enough. There's no minister who complains about this. Ministers are not part of this particular case at all. which suggests that this really is about these women in the congregation policing each other's behavior, policing each other's sort of social status, policing each other's social etiquette. So that is one example of something going on in church where we can learn more than if we're just looking at sermons themselves. Another place where we can think about what the consistory records can tell us about women. I'm just going to check time. Another place where we can learn something about what the consistory records tell us about women is the case of Jacquette Pierre. This painting has nothing to do with Geneva. It's a painting by Albrecht Dürer of a German woman. But I really like it because I think there's something about her facial expression that just says, like, look at me and take me seriously, which is what I'm trying to do with the women in the consistory record. So this story is about a confrontation that happens between two women in one of their houses. One is named Jacquette Pierre. She is a woman who was in trouble with the consistory because she decided not to take communion. But the reason that she gave was that she was in conflict with her stepchildren. And the consistory was very upset that she had taken it upon herself to decide that she was not going to be taking communion. So they started looking into this. And as part of their investigation into what was going on, they called a woman that she knew, Marguerite Barrault. And Marguerite Barrault had a different story about Jacquette. And her story was that one day, Jacquette had just shown up on Marguerite's doorstep unexpectedly, without an invitation, and had come in, and then I guess had gotten invited into her house. But when she came into her house, Jacquette was angry with Marguerite, accusing her of giving the consistory too much information and telling the consistory unnecessary things about Jacquette. And Marguerite said Jacquette said it was because of her. Jacquette was angry at her, and that was why she wasn't going to take communion. So here we have a neighborhood conflict going on between these two women. But what is especially interesting is that then Marguerite said Jacquette was so worked up that she pulled out her copy of the New Testament. And when I was thinking of this story for this talk, I was all excited because I as I remembered it, I thought she pulled it out of her pocket, and her dress had pockets, and that was so cool. And then I went back and looked, and it doesn't actually say anything about her pockets. So she might have just been holding it in her hand. But she had her own copy of the New Testament, and she brought it because she wanted to say, Marguerite told the consistory that Jacquette wanted to show her a New Testament which she paged through to find a passage by which she claimed to show that it was evil to scandalize one's neighbors like that. They don't say which passage, unfortunately, for us. But here we have an example, right, of a woman who has been called before the consistory for removing herself from communion, which the consistory did not think was okay. And that same woman is conducting a conflict with her neighbor with the use of scripture, right? Scripture that she is reading for herself. Marguerite responded to Jacquette throwing the New Testament in her face by saying that one must tell the truth rather than keep silent. And here we have a great example. Again, if you look beyond the fact that, if you take the time to look beyond what the consistory was originally investigating her for, we have a great example of two women in Geneva, neither one of them theologians, neither one of them married to ministers, really arguing about how Christian discipline should work in the church. Right? What is more harmful to the community? To report a problem or to not report a problem? What is the more Christian thing to do? To stay silent so as not to create scandal or to keep or yes, is staying silent a problem because you do not help to create reconciliation within the community and bring people to the consistory. What is even more interesting about this particular case is that by the time it gets back to the consistory a couple weeks later, the consistory doesn't care about Marguerite. They don't care about the New Testament. They don't care that there were two women arguing about the best way to enforce Christian discipline. They only care about Jacquette and her fight with her stepchildren and the fact that she had chosen not to take communion. But what is happening between these two women in a household is not the consistory's concern. I don't have a definite answer for that, but this is where the question of what was possible is so important. It was possible for them to have that argument between themselves, right? Without a male reformer there running it or telling them how they should be interpreting the scripture. It was possible for that to be part of the daily life of women in Geneva. One more story. Another thing that was possible in the daily lives of women in Geneva was socializing at the public baths. And this is, I actually didn't even know that Geneva still had functioning public baths until just a few years ago. It's not something that usually makes it into the histories of Reformation Geneva. And in many parts of Europe, public baths were closed down in this Reformation period. So it's even more unusual that Geneva's public baths stayed open. They were called the étuves, so that is how they're referred to in the consistory records. There were two of them in the city. They were regulated by the city government. One of the struggles of the city government during the Reformation was they tried repeatedly to set up a system so that one of the public baths would be just for women, and the second of the public baths would be just for men. And they had a really hard time enforcing that because the public baths were in part a site of socializing. People would go there with their neighbors. So husbands and wives would go to the public baths. Women would go with groups of their neighbors. And this picture, again, is not from Geneva. This is from France in the 1470s, but I love this picture of this French public bath because what they're doing here, right in the middle, right there, bathing and eating. The first time I saw that, I was like, what? But they were doing that in Geneva also. So people in Geneva would go socialize, bathe. There were different rooms, so you could have a room that was just with the party that you had gone there with. And it was people, again, across the spectrum of status and sort of socioeconomic level. So the story that I'm going to tell you about the public baths involved 4 women who went to the baths together, who were all wives of either ministers or church deacons or prominent church members, right? So they were committed to the reform. They knew John Calvin. They went to the public baths to socialize, and they end up before the consistory, not because they are in trouble. They're definitely not because they're in trouble for going to the public baths, but because they are reporting on a man named Nicolas Gentilly who had been spying on them at the public baths. So they were just there enjoying each other's company, and Gentilly, who just a few years before had actually worked for the city government as one of the representatives to the rural areas. That was a position called the Châtelain. So he was someone who had worked for the Reformed city government, but now these women are accusing him of looking at them through an opening in the wall, so that they were in their own room, and they said he had been looking at them, and as they reported this to the consistory, they said, being married, we told him that it was not honest for him to be looking at us. I think that being married part is very interesting. They didn't just say, like, what was he doing looking at us? But because we are married, he should not have been looking at us. And then they said that to him, and his response was, he did not know that it was them, and he wanted to tear his eyes out when he saw them. Strong response, but they also said that Gentilly as he had been talking, they were especially upset, maybe even more than the fact that he had been looking at them. They were especially upset that he had been insulting Adam of Genesis, because they said Adam had sinned, or they said that Gentilly said, because Adam had sinned, and without that, men would not have to hide their shame. In other words, he was saying to them, without Adam's original sin, men would have been free to flaunt their nakedness to women at the public baths whenever they wanted. The particular fact that he cited the Bible to make that statement was something that these women really wanted to emphasize to the consistory. But then they went on, and they said he had said many other, that was just one thing he said. He said many other prolix and vile words, and that his ranting lasted for at least 2 hours. 2 hours. They listened to him for 2 hours. That's what I'm telling you. 2 hours. For 2 hours without leaving. They didn't get up and leave. They didn't call for help. They didn't report him to the master of the baths. For 2 hours, they listened to him, and then they reported him to the consistory And when the consistory questioned him, Gentilly, about this, he denied ever having said that it was Adam's fault that we can't all enjoy seeing each other naked. In this case, he gets reprimanded. Gentilly absolutely gets in trouble. He gets sent to the city council for his behavior to get punished. And the consistory asks the city council to look into what is going on at the public baths because they should be separated. This should never have happened. But not once in this account do they ask the women what they were doing there in the first place, right? And so in this example, we learn it was perfectly respectable for 4 married women, some of whom were married to ministers, to spend an afternoon socializing at the public baths, going to the baths, undressing, sitting in a room together. This doesn't mention snacks, but that's possible. We also learn that when these women realized that there was a man there looking at them, their first response was to insist that this wasn't okay because they were married. Right? That tells us something about the way that they thought about how they occupied space and social interactions because they were married. Also, they sat there and listened to him talk for quite a long time. Nothing in their complaint suggested that they felt physically threatened by him. Nothing in their complaint suggested that he had actually menaced them in any way, except that him looking at them was a violation of their honor, and the way he used scripture to try to defend that was offensive to them. So we learn from that example something about how the wives of pastors spent their time, right? And something about the ways that you might socialize in your daily life. So you interact with other women at church, you interact with other women when you visit them in their homes, whether or not you are invited, and you interact with other women at public baths. Those are just three examples of places where we can, when we look closely into the consistory records, we can see women figuring out what they thought life should be like in a Geneva that was in the process of implementing the reform. And these 4 women in particular clearly saw themselves as being part of that reform, right? They clearly saw themselves as having honorable reputations that were being challenged by this man. If we just take sort of the surface of the consistory's concerns, those are the kinds of things that we miss, right? What we see is what upset the consistory. But if we start digging in a little bit deeper, we can see how complicated life was in Reformation Geneva, even in the shadow of this really the shadow that is represented, wait, I'm getting confused on my slides. The shadow that is represented by the Reformation wall. So to bring us back to that, in all of these stories, and those are just a few to sort of give you some examples, and in all of these cases that I'm looking at in the consistory records, what I'm trying to do is look past the consistory's initial concerns. And the reason that the Geneva consistory records are such a great opportunity to do this is because they are so thorough, right? They're really well preserved. The notary did not write everything down, but compared to consistory records in other places, they recorded a lot of what the witnesses said. And that information was not always directly pertinent to what the consistory was asking. But if we go back and read through carefully, we learn all sorts of things about the ways that women spent time, what they were responsible for, how they interacted with each other, and how they interacted with men in their daily lives. I put this picture up here because this is a picture from 19th century imagining of Reformation Geneva, a confrontation between Calvin and the libertines. So to take us back to Pernette Grant, that would have been her family and her social network, the libertines. So here Calvin is refusing the Lord's Supper to the libertines. There's one woman, as far as I can figure out in all those shadows, there is one woman in that picture. And I think that is, again, a good visual representation of how the story of the Reformation in Geneva has been told for a very long time. Not that women weren't there at all, but that they are hard to find. They're sort of off on the side, right? They're not as worth, not always as worth investing the time to look at because they are not the ones who are writing and leaving all of the works like Calvin that are part of spreading the Reformation beyond Geneva. On the other hand, we look more closely at how women were experiencing the Reformation in Geneva, we get a much better understanding, not only of the ideals and the goals, but of the messiness of what it really looked like to try to figure out how to create a community that was living somewhat according to these new ideals. And also, once we look beyond Geneva, looking more closely into the consistory records to see what is going on with the women is really crucial for connecting Geneva to the history of the rest of early modern Europe. Mm-hmm. So other historians in other places for a very long time also have been scared off by the shadow of that Reformation wall, also have tended to think, well, Geneva is an exceptional place, right? What was going on there was very different from what is going on in other parts of Europe. So a lot of women's history, for example, never mentions Geneva because there has been not that much work on sort of the daily lives of women, but also because they have bought into that kind of assumption that Geneva was exceptional, and so it's not a good comparison to the other places that they're studying in Europe. What I'm trying to do with my book project is to connect Geneva to these other conversations that are going on about other places in Europe. And I think digging more deeply into the consistory records, because we don't have women's journals, because we don't have maybe someday someone will discover like a packet of letters by your average woman in Geneva. But we have so few other personal sources for women in Reformation Geneva that the consistory records are sort of a gold mine to help us not only understand the complexity of daily life in the Reformation in Geneva, but to help us start thinking more fully about how daily life in Geneva compares and contrasts and connects with the ways that people were living in other parts of Europe. So that's what
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a wonderful presentation. If I could start out with a question, maybe a few years back, there's been a book by, I think, Susanna Lipscomb about the consistory in Nîmes in France.
Yes.
And she has a very interesting argument. She says that while women might have found the consistory to be an adversarial experience, they also deliberately used the consistory, particularly in order to compel men who had made marriage promises to go ahead and fulfill those marriage promises. And I wondered if that resonates with anything you've seen for Geneva so far and what you think of her argument.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was a really interesting book. And I think in terms of what I think of the overall book, I think that Susanna's book is important for sort of taking one more step away from only thinking about the consistory's concerns, and she's really trying to think about how women, I mean, in part of her discussion, she's almost talking about how women are collaborating with the consistory. And I think that there's another further step to take that is not only about sort of thinking about women's connections with the consistory, but that part about the ways that women are able to use the consistory to pursue some of their own ends. I think that does happen in Geneva, and I don't think that only happens for women.
Right.
I think that we have some of the work that Jeff Watt and Christian Gross have done give us some really good examples of the ways that the fact that the consistory in Geneva was interested in imposing reform discipline, but also, as Bob Kingdon started talking about, and as Jeff Watt has talked about more recently, as the consistory developed its work, it also focused more and more on almost family counseling kind of work, like really trying to get people to talk with each other and reconcile. And I think there are cases all throughout the consistory records of Genevans recognizing that. And Genevans, I mean, I think of, this isn't one about a woman in particular, but I can think of one case where there are parents who are so frustrated with their adult son for sort of spending their money, and they have not been able to resolve this family dynamic, and they bring him to the consistory to try to get some help in sorting that situation out. I think women absolutely, the consistory is absolutely a resource in terms of marriage promises, and even in terms of illegitimate children. The Genevan consistory was very intent on trying to make sure that men took responsibility. It didn't always come down to enforcing marriage, but making sure that men took responsibility for their children who were born outside of marriage. So yes, I think that we can find cases throughout the consistory of sometimes it's that Genevans absolutely are on the same page as the consistory, and they want to make sure that these ideas get enforced. But sometimes I think it's more that the Genevans have their priorities in terms of their kind of family concerns, and those priorities happen to intersect well with the consistory.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Karen? Randy?
Yeah, the existence of these public baths is utterly surprising to me that they continue to exist, because it seems like there's so much potential for things that the consistory would not like. And And it makes
Not
me
only
wonder-
potential.
And it makes me, wonder, do things like sex work in Geneva, which I assume was suppressed, does that go underground then, or what happens with those kinds of things?
So that is part of what I am exploring in my book, partly because there's one woman named Jean Clément who appears so many times in the consistory records for about 10 years. And I sort of stumbled across her and I was like, why has no one written about her? I searched everyone's indexes and she is really interesting. And part of what is interesting about her is that I'm not positive yet, but I'm pretty sure that she ran an informal prostitution business, mostly herself. And so, yes, I think that what goes on in Geneva during the Reformation is that there's no publicly acceptable brothel, and there's certainly some prostitution outside, but there are other places where brothels clearly move outside the city walls. That doesn't happen in Geneva. So what I suspect right now, based on the consistory cases with Jean Clément and a bunch of other women that she is connected to, is that it turns into this informal system that is much more about gifts than about like outright payments. So I can answer that more fully maybe in a couple of years. But yes, there is definitely, like, as far as I can tell, there is still some degree of sex work happening. And the degree to which like the other Genevans react to that or don't is really, really interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I have great fun reading consistory records with my students, and we enjoy seeing these stories. And one of the things that's sometimes frustrating is that you don't always get a clear resolution. People are admonished, or they're remanded to come back later, and then the next case doesn't show up, or they're remanded to the council. And I'm wondering if this woman, Jean Clément, would have been an example. I mean, if something becomes a criminal case, right, then it's not the consistory's main responsibility. Are there criminal records that you're also using that sort of show us another, even juicier set of interactions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that part of what is so fascinating about her in particular, and part of the reason I could not believe it when I was like, why has no one written about her? How is this possible? She goes to prison several times, at least 3 or 4 times. So and each time she goes to prison, she's sent to the city council. So there is a whole process over that 10 years where the consistory they never are able to outright convict her of adultery. They suspect her of adultery. She's married, which is part of what's so interesting about her. Her husband is in these cases sometimes. There's only one period of time when they actually seem to be fighting with each other. The rest of the time, he seems to be sort of fine with everything. So she gets sent to prison several times, but sort of like for suspicion of adultery. And then she gets to come home again. She has to pay for the time that she spent in jail, like pay for the food that she ate while she was there. And then she's sort of back interacting with people in society and running errands. And so yes, absolutely. In her case, what I don't know the very, very end of her story. She does disappear at the very end. But there is this whole period of time when she's going from consistory to city council to prison and then back again.
Are the criminal court records generally less detailed than the consistory records, just in terms of?
The actual so when it is just kind of the city council hearing something quickly, that is often less detailed. Not always, but often. If it actually goes to a full criminal trial, those are pretty extensive, but she never gets taken into a full criminal trial. Yeah.
Other questions? Lyle?
In the first case, you talked about the women were all sitting together in church. Was there a regulated separation of men and women in public worship? in Geneva, or did they just do that sort of informally? Or?
I don't, probably Karina knows that.
They sat
It's
separate. They
pretty-
sat separate. You did not sit with your family. You sat by gender, and then the children sit in front, so everyone can keep an eye on them and keep them quiet, because there's no Sunday school. So yeah, men here, women there, very common. And then there's some sort of more nicer seating for people who are city councilors or syndics or so on and so forth. They get like the special bench, but it is not by family but by gender that you sit. And you go up for communion also by gender and by order of rank. The most important people first. It's really interesting.
Mhm.
And that's something that's true in France
Yep.
also, right? Like Ray Menser and Graham Murdoch have written about the sort of status of seating in Reformed worship space.
That's fascinating.
Other questions, comments, insights, things you want to ask? Well, this has been a great opportunity. Thank you so much, Karen, for your
Thank you so much
presentation.
for
Please join me.
coming.
Thank you.